The twin sons of Tatooine cast a harsh light across the barren desert as Obi-Wan Kenobi stood outside the Lars homestead. A somber expression etched across his weathered face. It was a heavy decision, one he had deliberated over for years while watching Luke Skywalker grow from a boy into a young man. The truth, as painful as it was, could no longer be hidden. He knew that Luke deserved to know who he truly was, who his father truly was, and the pivotal moments that had shaped the galaxy into its current fractured state. The journey to Mustafar was a solemn one. As they soared through hyperspace aboard a borrowed freighter, Luke could sense something different about Obi-Wan. The old Jedi, usually so measured and reserved, seemed burdened by an invisible weight. Luke had grown used to the mysterious ways of his mentor, but this felt different. Obi-Wan's eyes held a distant sadness, a reflection of past wounds that never fully healed. When they arrived at Mustafar, Luke was struck by the planet's raw, unforgiving landscape. Rivers of molten lava carved through jagged black rocks, and the air shimmered with heat. It was a place that seemed to embody suffering and destruction, a place unfit for life. Yet it was here that Obi-Wan had chosen to bring him. Standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking the fiery abyss, Obi-Wan turned to Luke. His voice, steady yet tinged with regret, broke the silence. "Luke," he began, "there is much about your father that I have not told you. Much about me, about the Jedi, about the galaxy as it is now. It's time you learned the truth." Luke's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? I know you said my father was a great pilot, a hero during the Clone Wars. Your father was much more than that," Obi-Wan interrupted gently. "Anakin Skywalker was one of the most gifted Jedi I had ever known. Strong in the Force, brave, loyal, but he was also vulnerable. Vulnerable to fear, to anger, to attachment. Those vulnerabilities were exploited, and they led him down a path I failed to prevent." Obi-Wan's gaze shifted to the molten river below, as though he could see the memories playing out before him. His voice trembled slightly as he continued. "The Jedi Order, the guardians of peace and justice for 1,000 generations, were betrayed. Betrayed by one of their own. Your father, Anakin, became Darth Vader." Luke froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. Darth Vader, the dark enforcer of the Empire, the man responsible for the deaths of countless beings, including Luke's own mentor, Owen Lars. Couldn't be true. "No," Luke whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible. My father was a hero. He was good. He was," Obi-Wan said softly. "He was a hero, but he was also human. He loved deeply, and he feared losing those he loved. In his desperation to save them, he made a terrible choice. He turned to the dark side, believing it would give him the power to change fate. It was a lie, Luke. A lie told by the Emperor to ensnare him." The words hung in the air, each one a dagger in Luke's heart. He wanted to reject them, to call Obi-Wan a liar, but the sorrow in his mentor's voice was undeniable. There was more to the story, and Luke couldn't walk away now. "Why here?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why Mustafar?" "Because this is where it all ended," Obi-Wan said. "This is where Anakin Skywalker died, and Darth Vader was born. This is where I fought him, where I tried to stop him, and where I—" He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "Where I left him to die." Luke staggered back as if struck. The betrayal, the pain, it was overwhelming. You killed my father?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You're the reason he turned into that monster?" Obi-Wan's expression darkened with regret. "No, Luke, I didn't kill your father. He was consumed by his own choices, by his own fears. When I faced him here, he was already lost to the dark side. I fought him to protect the galaxy, to stop him from causing more harm. It was the hardest thing I've ever done." He looked directly into Luke's wide, tear-filled eyes. "But I failed. I couldn't bring myself to deliver the final blow. Instead, I left him broken and burning on this very ground. The man I loved as a brother was gone, but his hatred kept him alive. That hatred forged Darth Vader." Luke turned away, unable to meet Obi-Wan's gaze. The revelations were too much. The father he had idolized in his dreams was gone, replaced by a shadow of darkness and despair. And the man he had trusted as a mentor had played a part in it all. Obi-Wan placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, his voice earnest. "I've carried this burden for years, Luke. Not a day goes by that I don't feel the weight of my failures. I should have been able to save him. I should have been a better Jedi, a better friend. But I didn't tell you this to ask for your forgiveness or your understanding. I told you because you needed to know the truth." Luke pulled away, his heart torn between anger and sorrow. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why tell me now after all this time?" "Because you have a choice to make," Obi-Wan said gravely. "You are strong in the Force, just as your father was. The Emperor knows this, and so does Vader. They will try to turn you just as they turned him. You must be ready, Luke. Ready to face them, ready to resist them. But most of all, ready to redeem the legacy of the Jedi." The words struck a chord within Luke, stirring something deep inside him. Despite his anguish, he felt the flicker of resolve, a glimmer of purpose. He looked back at Obi-Wan, his expression hardening. "I won't become like him," Luke said firmly. "I won't let the dark side win." Obi-Wan nodded, his eyes glistening with pride and sadness. "I believe in you, Luke. I always have." As the fiery landscape of Mustafar roared around them, Luke stared into the abyss, the echoes of his father's fall and Obi-Wan's despair etched into his soul. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he would fight. For his father, for the galaxy, and for himself. And so, with the weight of the truth on his shoulders, Luke Skywalker began his journey into the heart of darkness, determined to bring light where once there was only shadow. The heat of Mustafar's air seemed to press down on them as Obi-Wan struggled to find the words. Luke stood silent, his face pale and unreadable, still absorbing the revelation that his father had become Darth Vader. But Obi-Wan wasn't done, not yet. The truth of Anakin Skywalker's fall was deeper and darker than just one man's choices. It was tied to forces far older and far more insidious than Luke could have imagined. "Luke," Obi-Wan began, his voice heavy, "there's more you must understand. Your father's fall wasn't just a tragedy of one man succumbing to the dark side. It was part of a greater plan, an ancient and terrible scheme orchestrated by the Sith Lords." Luke looked at him, confused and wary. "The Sith? I've heard you mention them before, but what are they, really?" Obi-Wan's face tightened, his expression hard as he spoke. "The Sith are the ancient enemies of the Jedi. For generations, they sought power through the dark side of the Force, thriving on hatred, anger, and fear. 1,000 years ago, the Jedi believed the Sith were destroyed, but we were wrong. They survived in secret, biding their time, growing stronger. And in the end, they orchestrated the fall of the Republic itself." Luke's eyes widened, his confusion deepening. "The Republic? The Empire replaced it, didn't it? I thought it was just politics." "No," Obi-Wan said sharply. "It was much more than that. The Republic was not perfect, but it was a democracy, a union of thousands of star systems working together for peace and prosperity. It was a more civilized age, Luke, an age where justice and reason prevailed, where the Jedi served as peacekeepers, not warriors." He paused, his voice trembling with the weight of memory. "But the Sith, led by Darth Sidious, who you now know as Emperor Palpatine, deceived us all. Sidious played both sides in the Clone Wars, pitting the Republic against the Separatists, creating a conflict that allowed him to seize ultimate power. He didn't just destroy the Jedi. He corrupted the Republic from within, turning it into the empire you've grown up under." Luke stared at Obi-Wan, his mind racing. "You're saying the Emperor was a Sith Lord this whole time?" "Yes," Obi-Wan said grimly. "Sidious was the puppet master, manipulating every aspect of the war to his advantage. He turned the Senate into a tool for his ambitions, eroding its principles and replacing democracy with tyranny. And your father, Anakin, was his greatest victim." "Victim?" Luke's voice was filled with skepticism. "You just told me my father chose to join him, to turn to the dark side. And he did, Obi-Wan admitted, his tone laced with sorrow. But he was seduced, Luke. Seduced by Sidious's lies and promises of power. Sidious knew Anakin's weaknesses, his fear of loss, his love for your mother, and he exploited them. He twisted Anakin's loyalty to the Jedi and the Republic, turning it into anger and resentment. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Luke took a step back, trying to reconcile everything Obi-Wan was telling him. His father wasn't just a Jedi who fell to darkness. He was ensnared in a web of lies spun by a Sith Lord, a creature of pure evil. How did no one see this coming? Luke asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. How could the Jedi let this happen? Obi-Wan closed his eyes briefly, as if the weight of that question was too much to bear. The Jedi were blinded by our own arrogance. We believed we had defeated the Sith, that they could never return. But Sidious was clever. He hid in plain sight, using the Republic's own corruption and weaknesses against it. By the time we realized the truth, we were scattered, divided, and vulnerable. Luke's fists clenched as anger flared within him. And you just let it happen? You let the Sith destroy everything? No! Obi-Wan's voice cracked with intensity, his pain visible. We fought, Luke. We fought to the very end. But Sidious had a plan for everything. He turned the clones, soldiers we thought were our allies, against us. He issued Order 66, a command that branded the Jedi as traitors. In a single day, thousands of Jedi were hunted down and murdered by those we trusted. I survived because of luck, and because I had to protect your father's children. The weight of those words settled heavily on Luke's chest. The idea that the Jedi were slaughtered by the very soldiers they led into battle, that the galaxy had been betrayed from within, was almost too much to comprehend. Anakin told me all this himself, Obi-Wan said, his voice quieter now, haunted. After he swore himself to Sidious, he boasted of the Sith's triumph. He believed they had won, that their rule would last forever. He had abandoned everything he once stood for, consumed by the belief that power was all that mattered. Luke turned away, staring into the molten rivers below. His father wasn't just a victim of his own choices. He was a pawn in a game that had spanned generations. The Sith, the Jedi, the Republic, the Empire. It all felt so much larger than him, so much more complicated than he had ever imagined. But why bring me here, to this place? Luke asked, his voice barely audible. Why tell me all of this now? Because the fight isn't over, Obi-Wan said firmly. Sidious and Vader believe they've destroyed the Jedi, that the light of the Force has been extinguished. But they're wrong. As long as you live, as long as you carry the legacy of your father and the Jedi, there is hope. You are the last chance, Luke. The last chance to restore balance to the Force and to bring an end to the Sith. Luke turned back to Obi-Wan, his face hardening with determination. Then teach me, he said. Teach me how to fight them. Teach me how to stop them, so I can finish what the Jedi started. Obi-Wan's eyes glistened with pride and sadness as he placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. I will do everything I can to prepare you, Luke. But know this. The path ahead will be more difficult than you can imagine. You will face temptation, pain, and loss. And the greatest challenge of all will come when you face your father, not as the man he once was, but as Darth Vader. The fiery glow of Mustafar illuminated their faces as the weight of their mission settled between them. Luke felt the pull of his destiny, the enormity of what lay ahead. But he also felt something else, a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, he could succeed where others had failed.